Welcome everyone to the Autism Now What podcast. Today, I am so excited to be speaking to Christopher Soppet, who is a certified health coach. He calls himself the Autism Recovery Coach, which I am super excited about. Now, Christopher has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Illinois. Most importantly, he is the father of two beautiful children, one of which was diagnosed with autism at age 3. He has been incorporating biomedical treatments with his son for over 5 years, and now he is in a classroom. This boy is with neurotypical peers. He's got no classroom aid. There's no need for an IEP. He's got neurotypical friends. He's compassionate, social, affectionate, loving, empathetic, and he possesses all the traits that a parent longs for in a child and that a person needs to develop intentional relationships in life. This is such a beautiful and inspiring story, and we are very, very privileged to be speaking to Chris today, who is going to share more about his son and his journey and experience with autism and that wonderful, beautiful outcome that I've just read about. Now, I'm going to jump straight into questions. Chris, what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning?
Well, thank you, Elena, for having me on. It's quite an honor to have someone like you value what I have to say. To answer that first question, I think it'd be more valuable for most of your listeners to kind of transport back 5 years ago when I was in the midst of, like, we'll call it the autism crisis. And anybody who's dealing with autism knows what I would mean by that life really is just a crisis every day. It's one crisis after another that just kind of roll into each other from, did my child soil the bed? Do I need to clean up carpet first thing in the morning? Do I need to put up with a tantrum? Do I need to, what kind of food is this child going to be willing to eat first thing in the morning? Everything is just crisis. But when you are determined that autism is treatable and that you're going to do everything you can to make sure that your child has a lease on life that's equal or better than what you were given. And I think that's really what every parent, whether they parent a child with autism or not, really comes into the world, brings their child into the world with. It just takes a lot more when you're dealing with autism. And so getting out of bed, I would say it was really hard in the beginning, but as time went on and we started to see more and more progress being made with the biomedical treatments, with the therapy, it was very inspiring. And getting out of bed came with a lot more hope than it did in those early days. In the early days, it took determination to say, I'm going to help my kid through this. And then as you get more hope with every victory that you achieve, it just you become more inspired to do more for your kid. And that's really what would get me out of bed every day, especially back in the days of the autism crisis. Now it's a lot easier. In fact, it's easier for me to hit snooze, and I would say I'm less inspired to get out of bed now that my child's doing so much better. It really was that struggle and that constant crisis that really was my inspiration out of bed.
I think you describe it very well as a crisis. I remember the very early days with David, and Martin and I also struggling to get out of bed when in the early days of first being introduced to autism. I remember Martin saying that it felt like a nightmare that he just was not waking up from. But then, once you realize that you actually have treatment options, that's what fuels your hope. And as long as you can have hope you can get out of bed, you know. So those
Yes.
having the right information to understand what treatments are available is extremely important, because that's what's going to fuel your hope. Now, you chose to study a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and then why did you decide later on to study to become a health coach?
Yeah, so actually, it seems like the two are related, but there was actually no intention to be a health coach early on. I went into chemistry just kind of following in sort of my family's footsteps. My father retired as an engineer. His father was involved in science, worked at nuclear power plant. So, you know, science was kind of something that I was not only interested in, but I guess something that kind of was a family heirloom, so to speak. Chemistry, as opposed to engineering, I didn't really have any interest in engineering, but I kind of went the chemistry route because I've always had an interest in health and fitness, even from a young age. And I would read things in like nutrition books and things of that sort. And I didn't really understand it, but I always wanted to learn more. And, even processes back then, like methylation back in the late 90s, which was really poorly understood back then, it was mentioned. And I want to know what that was about. So I went into studying chemistry with the intention of becoming a chemistry teacher. I didn't really have any interest in working in a lab, but I did end up teaching high school science for several years before changing careers. But fast forwarding to 2020, when we had the lockdowns and all of the basically the social isolation that went on with that, and any autism family already experiences social isolation as it is, and to have your essential services cut off, and it really just inspired me to go down this path. I always saw myself trying to give back to the autism community, and it felt like it was too soon, but the timing was just right with everything that was going on. I decided to just get certified and begin it, and here we are now,
I'm
3 years later.
I'm so glad that you did. And I'm so glad that you're able to coach families, because your service is so needed, because there are so many families confused, worried, not knowing how to help their children. And the fact that you can coach them and guide them is really, really wonderful. Now,
it's easy to be confused because there's so much information out there. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's just, you're not going to get anything because it's just too much coming at you.
well, this is the thing, but with your chemist, you see, you weren't just anybody else. You had a chemistry degree. And so that's why when you did start researching, you could grasp exactly what was going on, and you could begin to really understand the true makeup of autism and understand, the treatment. So now it's amazing that you can pass that on to the other families, because not every parent has a chemistry degree. Okay.
This is true.
And actually, that's what it takes, to be able to help a child on the spectrum. But now you can pass that on. And also, you share your experience with your son, who was diagnosed with autism at age 3.
I'll give you the short version, or else we would have to do a series together. So my son was diagnosed at 3, but I began to suspect that there was something not quite right. Probably around 18 months of age. I would say he developed normally to that point, with the exception that his language development was a little bit delayed in hindsight. He had single words, but he wasn't putting anything together. He wasn't making requests. It was kind of like labeling things is what he was doing. And At about 20 months of age, there's a group called Easter Seals in the United States that works with helping parents with special needs. They put out a free, kind of like a questionnaire that you would fill out to just see how your child is developing. And when it was clear that he wasn't meeting your developmental criteria, I started to become concerned. And in fact, we didn't get the diagnosis till he turned 3, but I had began looking into biomedical treatments shortly after his second birthday and started implementing those probably around 2.5 years of age. In the beginning, I didn't really know as obviously as much as I do now, but I'd say by about 2.5 is when we really began to notice changes from it. And not that I'm recommending this for every single person out there, but the methyl B12 injections were really the catalyst that started everything moving. If I could just share with you, I decided to write a letter to the Food and Drug Administration in the US when they were putting before committee a couple of years ago, actually pulling methyl B12 from the market and regulating it as a drug. So this is the account that I sent them. This is part of the letter. It was on March 14th, 2018, when I gave my son his very first methyl B12 shot. We have kept meticulous notes on his development. The morning after his first shot, my wife and I noticed him playing with his toys, but instead of lining them up, as he usually did, he was making them walk. 2 days later, on a trip to the park, he displayed a noticeable increase in bravery on the playground equipment, choosing to climb instead of just running around aimlessly. The day after that, his mother left his sight when we were in public as a family, and he shouted, "Where's mommy?" from a child with barely any word combination at this point in time. About 1 week in, he began initiating eye contact for the first time in his life, initiating play, initiating affection, etc. 2 weeks in, he pointed at something for the very first time in his life. 3 weeks in, his word combining went from the occasional 2-word phrase to multiple spontaneous 3-word phrases. His mental faculties were brought to life with this treatment, and this growth continues to this day. And I was just one of many parents that were kind of, devastated to hear that this treatment was going to be potentially pulled from the market. And I think the committee was overwhelmed by letters like these and decided that they were going to leave it. It was actually a pretty narrow vote, but they did vote to leave it for now. So hopefully we continue to have access to this treatment because it's helped a lot of things, including myself. But to wrap up the answer to that question, that was kind of the beginning of it, and things just snowballed from there. Gluten-free, dairy-free diets, low oxalate diets, different vitamins, different therapies. ABA was very helpful and instrumental in his recovery, especially the way that we did it. We did not do it according to the standard protocol, which I can elaborate on that if we have time. But it's all hands on deck. There's no magic pill, there's no magic shot, at least not at this point. It really comes down to just doing everything in your power to fix the broken biochemistry in the body and then running with that. So using every bit of daylight that you have to accelerate that development when you have the chance to do that.
Chris, your story is profound. Listening to you reading the letter to the Food and Drug Administration that you spoke about gave me goosebumps, honestly. His dramatic improvement just from B12 shots is incredible. And you said his mental faculties were brought to life. Well, that's going to lead me to my next question, which is then, is autism permanent or can it be reversed?
anything can be reversed, with the proper knowledge. I think that it really comes down to figuring out, with autism specifically, it comes down to figuring out where the root cause, or getting closer to that root cause. I think we never really will know specifically what triggered our child's autism. I think those cases are rare where we know specifically what triggered it. But if we can get closer to that root cause, the treatments become more effective. Obviously, the earlier you begin the intervention, the faster you'll make progress. That's not to discourage parents of children who maybe have 7, 8, 10, 16-year-old, or even adult children from doing these treatments. It's going to be helpful. It's just a matter of what are your chances of getting to full recovery? How fast will the improvements be noticed? The earlier, the better.
I agree with you. I always say that when a child has autism, one of the doctors taught me this many years ago that I consulted with, and he said, I'll never forget his words. He said, it's like a house on fire. So the longer the fire burns, the more damage it's going to do. So early intervention is important, because if the fire just starts burning and you can put it out, there's less to renovate. So I absolutely agree with you on that. And I also have to agree that we are getting closer to a root cause. There are many published research papers on root causes and different treatments. Sadly, very few medical professionals are aware of this, and as you know, it's very difficult for parents to access the right doctor who can guide them on this journey. Now, is autism genetic?
I think it'd be undeniable to say that there's a genetic component. However, to say that autism is genetic I think it's deceitful. I don't even think it's false. I believe it's intentionally deceitful for anybody who, with any type of scientific clout, to say that, because even it seems to be a consensus that there's both a genetic component and an environmental contribution to the rise in autism that we're seeing. There's just no way to go from 50 years ago, even with better diagnostics and more awareness. You can't go from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 50 over a 50-year period. That's a 100-fold increase, unless we believe that parents in the 1970s and 80s were so blind that they could see a child spinning in the corner, smearing their feces on the wall, and not suspect that anything's wrong with their kid. I mean, we're not talking about people who maybe have an obsession with vacuums and open a vacuum store. We're talking about very, very serious, debilitating condition that is on the rise, and it's unmistakable. It's on the rise. So I think to say it's genetic, which might contribute to, purely genetic autism, is probably less than 1% of what's out there.
It's a very interesting explanation that you give. Now, you talk about broken biochemistry in children with autism. Elaborate on that for me.
So I like to emphasize, because there's this, this neurodiversity, neurodivergent movement, which is aiming to normalize autism. And I'm all for acceptance of people, but I'm not for acceptance of a man-made disease, or at least one that's coming primarily from human contribution. I'm very much against that. So I'm not fixing a broken child. The child's not broken. Their biochemistry is broken. We can fix that. Now, what that means specifically is going to be different in every child's case, but what we can see is that there are things broken in the bioenergetic pathways. So if you look at, mitochondrial function, it's almost always dysfunctional in children with autism. You look at methylation. Methylation is always dysfunctional in autism. The endogenous antioxidant system is always broken. There's usually immune dysfunction. So these are things that can be, if not fixed, um, patched up and corrected so that they don't cause, like you said, kind of putting out the fire. We can put out the fire even if we haven't identified the arsonist yet. We can continue putting out that fire, keeping water on it so that, you know, the arsonist can run around and try to do his damage, but we're preventing that damage. We're doing damage control in the meantime until we get more clues to figure out what is actually causing. And in some cases, we never will, but we can continue to see improvement and stay on, you know, keeping that fire from burning by putting in the right measure.
I'm on the same page. And I like how you said the child is not broken. It's the biochemistry that's broken. I don't accept my 20-year-old son, David, who's severely autistic. I don't accept his autism because it's debilitating for my family and for him. You know, we continue to fight for his independence and functionality. I think that there's a very much needed reclassification of the diagnosis of autism. I'm really hoping for reform with the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. I also, you know, absolutely agree with you that, you know, if there are neurodiverse individuals, they should be included into society. But I do say to parents, there's nothing to accept about an autism diagnosis, because would you accept diabetes? No, you would look for your insulin, right? So it's the same with autism.
Exactly.
And you highlighted very, very important conditions that are contributing to the autism symptoms: mitochondria, the immune system, methylation. Okay, so the trying to help the detoxification system. So treating all these things can alleviate the autism symptoms. And I've seen this in 2 of my children diagnosed with autism. Now, what are the stats on autism currently? And can you, what are your thoughts on the incidence of autism?
Yeah, so currently, I believe the most recent stats that I saw, I'm not on really on top of this because it's very depressing, but I believe the most recent, at least in the United States, was 1 in 38 children are diagnosed with autism. We're like, I mean, that's about 3%. So and there's a researcher from MIT, Stephanie Seneff, who I believe, don't quote me on this, you'll have to look at her specific work, but I think she extrapolated that by the year 2030, we would be approaching a 1 in 2 diagnostic for autism in children. And at that point, the burden on society just wouldn't be, I mean, it's just not sustainable. We're already kind of approaching that point. And if this continues without any type of abatement, it's just going to get to the point where we won't have the resources.
Yeah, the incidence of autism is steadily increasing, and it's very concerning, and it is truly a global crisis. So I have to agree with you there. Now, is psychiatric medication first-line treatment for children with autism, in your opinion?
So I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not going to tell any parent whose child is on psychiatric medication to stop that. And psychiatric medication falls into different classes. There's things such as SSRIs, and then there's atypical antipsychotics. I would say that if your child is a threat to harming themselves or others, that it becomes a lot more essential to maybe have that discussion with your doctor about putting them on medication, especially at least just for the short term. However, those behaviors I mentioned are often can be addressed with diet and biomedical interventions. And if that's not enough, I mean, obviously you have to, as a parent, have to weigh whether or not those behaviors are serious enough that they need to be treated like right away, or if they can wait to see if biomedical intervention can be enough to calm those down. So, like, you know, self-injurious behavior, as you know, is not something that is fun to witness. In fact, that's the last word I would use to describe it. And if they're a threat to others, that's a huge deal as well. So I don't totally write off psychiatric medication, but unless it's a very serious case, I would say there's other things that can be done.
Yeah, so I agree with you. My oldest son, David, who's profoundly autistic, I mean, I know you read my book, and I talk about his teenagers, and we definitely needed to use periods of the psychiatric medication to rescue him. And so if there is a child who is having this kind of self-injurious behavior, then definitely while you're trying to determine what are the underlying causes, it is something to consider. And I did put my son on psychiatric medication during those times when the wheels came off. We would then always go back to the drawing board to try and unravel, okay, well, what caused the dam wall to break? But it is an important medication when the child is just when their functionality is just in complete breakdown, and they tantruming and they're screaming and the family's not sleeping and they hurting themselves or they're hurting others. I couldn't agree with you more. In South Africa, pretty much parents walk into a neurologist, they get an autism diagnosis, they walk out pretty much with psychiatric medication as first line treatment. And that happens a lot. So now I wanted to ask you about the gut-brain connection. In your opinion, is there a gut-brain connection in autism?
I mean, I think at this point, you wouldn't be able to deny that any more than you can deny that there's not a purely genetic component to autism. The gut certainly affects the brain. They're connected. So inflammation in the gut is going to cause inflammation on the brain. And additionally, if you have dysbiosis in your gut, not only is that going to possibly trigger inflammation that will affect the brain, but there are also pathogenic bacteria that can produce toxins that will be absorbed into the bloodstream. And then those toxins can then inhibit mitochondrial enzymes. They can inhibit different conversion of neurotransmitters between each other. So there's really a lot that the gut influences other than just digestion and absorption. It's also a matter of detoxification versus retoxification, which that's absorption of toxins in the gut as opposed to elimination of toxins through the gut. So yeah, there's very much a gut-brain connection. In my line of work, what I've found is that there isn't really a whole lot that's agreed on in terms of like established protocols that, from what I've seen, that work with a wide swath of kids. It seems like the gut is very individualized. While I do think it's important to look at the gut, see if there's different pathogens like parasites or particularly egregious bacteria like Clostridia difficile or H. pylori, those certainly need to be treated. But I would caution parents from jumping straight into antibiotics when they see dysbiosis, because we have to remember our mitochondria, from whether you believe in creation or evolution, we have to acknowledge that bacteria are really the predecessors of our mitochondria. So when we're taking antibiotics, we're a lot of times we're harming mitochondrial function, which is already compromised in the gut. And not only that, but antibiotics are not like a heat-seeking missile that go directly for the pathogen we're trying to target. They usually take out quite a bit of collateral damage in that process. And what were the conditions that led to that dysbiosis in the first place? Was it because the child took too many antibiotics? possibly, maybe that contributed, but there's also the very real and very likely contributing factor that because of the mitochondrial dysfunction, the migrating motor complex in the gut is not working the way it should be. So basically, food is sitting in there too long, and that's allowing pathogenic bacteria to flourish. If we don't address the mitochondria, you can kill all the pathogens you want. And I'm not saying that that's not warranted in cases where there are things like C. diff and H. pylori, like I mentioned, but we need to make sure that we're changing those underlying conditions of the gut by improving the mitochondria so that it doesn't just revert back to what it was prior.
I think what you've shared now is very, very valuable to many parents who are already following a biomedical treatment protocol, because I know in the early years with my son David, we did give him lots of those antibiotics for the gut. And I have also learned over the years about the role of the mitochondria. Am I correct in saying that sluggish mitochondria can also cause constipation? It could be one of the causes. There can be many causes of constipation, but sluggish mitochondria can contribute to constipation as well, correct?
Yeah, I would say that's one of the major contributing factors is it's just that the migrating motor complex is not working the way it should. So normally our food is supposed to be constantly moving through the intestine. And the reason why having a daily morning, particularly a morning bowel movement, is important is because that is really an indicator that the mitochondria are doing their job, that migrating motor complex is working while we sleep. If a child is having a daily bowel movement, that's good. But if it's not happening in the morning and there isn't a reason like, oh, they're waking up 5 minutes before they need to get out the door for school, those kinds of things do happen. But if you don't naturally have the urge to have a bowel movement in the morning, what it means is that your body is requiring physical movement like running and standing and sitting and that type of physical movement to get things moving. So it's kind of like keeping your heart going through CPR. That's great if it keeps you alive, but we got to figure out how to get it working on its own. So if you're having a daily bowel movement, if it's happening in the afternoon, what that's saying is that your intestines are kind of needing CPR, so to speak, to get things moving. And it does take a lot of time. It's not an overnight process for sure. There's different tricks we can do to make sure that that movement's happening, but our ultimate goal is to make sure that it's happening on its own, and that one of those signs is morning.
Very, very interesting. I think, whoever's listening today is taking notes, because I remember learning about the role of mitochondria in all of this, and it's fascinating and it's so informative. And it's encouraging because, it's good for parents to know this is something they can discuss with their coach, with, or their biomedical doctor, because mitochondria plays a big role and, treating that. Now, parents will say to me, you want me to give him vitamin and mineral supplements, like I'm going to harm my child. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how children on the spectrum lack certain essential vitamins and minerals?
Certainly. So as we know, a lot of children on the autism spectrum have limited diets. Some of that we impose on them because we're trying to limit inflammatory foods like gluten and casein, or in some cases eggs, or whatever they happen to be sensitive to. But in a lot of cases, they'll self-limit. So you've probably all heard of, hopefully someone else's kid who's, will only eat chicken nuggets, something like that. So there is that aspect. However, I think in the majority of cases, what it comes down to is impaired digestion. When the enteric nervous system is not sending the right messages to your pancreas and your liver and the small intestine, you're not getting those digestive enzymes to break down the food and get access to the vitamins that they contain. Inflammation in the gut affects absorption of a lot of the nutrients. So vitamin B1, vitamin B12, for instance, can't be absorbed when there's inflammation in the gut, or being greatly reduced at least. A lot of times there's metabolic processing inefficiencies. So this is where the genetic component can come in. You know, we've all heard of MTHFR defects, which seem to be overblown because 80% of the population has some quote unquote defect in MTHFR function. But, you know, that's one example of where our dietary needs are increased because our body is inefficient in recycling or processing certain nutrients. There's also increased metabolic demand. So when the body's in a fight or flight state, like a lot of our kids are, you can tell by like dilated pupils and their panic attacks and the hypersensitivity to the environment. They're in a constant state of fight or flight. And you're burning through nutrients so inefficiently just to maintain that state, keep the adrenaline going. So they're wasting a lot of minerals as well. So like one of the functions of the kidney is not only to get rid of toxins, but it's also to reabsorb nutrients that are needed. One of those is, you know, magnesium. So we get magnesium in our blood. Some of it ends up going through the kidney. Instead of putting it back in the bladder, the kidney is supposed to put some of it back into the blood. You can say the same thing with sulfate. Pretty much any nutrient that needs to be maintained, there can be inefficiencies and increased demand there as well. So, you know, these really high level of nutrients that are in some of these autism spectrum formulations, it's for a reason, not because we need 10 times what the recommended daily allowance is, but because our body requires that much to overcome some of these inefficiencies along the way.
That was a really good summary on vitamin and mineral deficiency. And also, like I'll say to parents, for the child to have good language, they need vitamin D3. And, you know, my younger son did so well on folinic acid, folate actually. Aaron, my youngest, who recovered from autism, lost his diagnosis. Within 48 hours of supplementing folate, he turned his voice back on. So obviously,
wow.
48 hours. In 48 hours, he started to say a sound. He had been silent for about 6 months. We didn't hear a single sound. And you know, I wrote about it in my book, but, you know, put him onto folate, 48 hours into folate, and we heard a sound. He said bah, bah, bah again, and my team just cried. Now, every child is different, so it is important to, you know, determine what vitamin and mineral supplements are missing for your specific child. But now, Chris, tell me, you know, the parents will say, I'm so tired, I'm falling asleep at the wheel, my child won't fall to sleep, they won't stay to sleep. I don't know what's keeping them up at night. They're exhausted. They are physically drained. They are emotionally drained. Just put us in the picture with sleep and autism.
Yeah, sleep is one of the hardest ones because, I mean, I don't think you sleep much, but I need a lot of sleep. Like if I don't get 7 to 8 hours, like just leave me alone. You don't want to talk to me. My brain's not working right. So I can totally sympathize with that. We didn't have a huge struggle with sleep for most of our autism crisis. We did have some periods where, you know, certain detoxification processes definitely interfered with that. And I totally sympathize with parents that deal with this on a daily or frequent basis. One of the things we need to make sure is that the gut is, because if your gut is in pain, you're not going to be able to sleep. And especially if communication is a struggle. I mean, all children, whether they're neurotypical or not, sometimes have difficulty expressing to us the reason for why they're acting out. But especially in those with the communication challenges. I remember it wasn't until my son was about 3.5 that when he was crying one time, he held his stomach and said, ouch. And then we were able to tell, like, okay, that's why he's upset. Otherwise, it was just like we were just trying to read his mind. So let's make sure the gut is moving, make sure that the child has enough magnesium, especially. It's one of the most important minerals that you can get. For one, it does help with the gastrointestinal motility, but it's also very calming in a lot of cases. So that can be helpful. In some cases, melatonin is needed because in order for melatonin, that's the hormone in our body that controls the circadian rhythm. It tells us, okay, I'm tired now, turn off the mind, go to sleep. And melatonin requires that methylation, the methylation process be working because there's a step in the synthesis of melatonin from serotonin that requires methylation. And if that's not working, then there's probably a shortage of that and the circadian rhythm is thrown off. So for a short period of time while we're working on methylation, some families do see benefit from melatonin. One thing I would caution against is just going to the store and getting like a melatonin gummy and that's going to solve the problems. That will help the child fall asleep. But often what happens is the child will then wake up in the middle of the night because that melatonin, it's a short-lived form when it's given as an oral dose. So if your child's not able to swallow like a time release tablet that will release that melatonin slowly throughout the night, there's other ways we can do it with, transdermal application that is slower. And then, like I said, just working on that root cause, which is probably the methylation component so that they can make their own melatonin.
It's so nice to hear you give explanations and reasons, for things that are going on. It's so informative. It's so, I get excited when I hear you explaining these things because I've experienced exactly what you're saying with 2 of my kids. And, my oldest David took melatonin for long periods of time. But again, the melatonin alone is not enough. We've got to go beyond that. Again, the message today for parents listening is that there are many reasons that are causing these symptoms that you are being presented with, and there are many treatments for the child's autism. Now, we know that inflammation is driven by the immune system. You touched on inflammation in the gut and the brain. Can you share your thoughts on the role of inflammation in autism? Both my boys did very well on anti-inflammatories. My youngest, Aaron, it was one of the big reasons we were able to regain speech. Aaron was on anti-inflammatories for around 2 years straight. I would pulse the anti-inflammatories. I would go between prescriptives. I used ibuprofen. Of course, we're not giving medical advice yet today, so parents must be guided by their doctor. But for my son, Aaron, and there is a protocol called Stop Calling It Autism, which talks about the ibuprofen. I read that protocol for Aaron, and the ibuprofen was amazing. We used to do 10 days on, 10 days off. I always would have him on a natural anti-inflammatory when he wasn't on a prescriptive. So I would use glialia, curcumin, even Amiga can be an anti-inflammatory. And I would always remind myself, okay, where's the anti-inflammatory? And it worked wonders for Aaron. That was a big reason he regained speech and developed speech.
Yeah, one thing I do caution, some of the natural anti-inflammatories have kind of like they can trigger hyperactivity in some kids because many of them are highly phenolic compounds, which our kids struggle to process. It's a plant flavonoid, but for our children are lacking, their sulfur chemistry is lagging, and the body needs to remove those phenols or they start to interfere with neurotransmitters, and it can cause hyperactivity. But yeah, inflammation is definitely one of the driving causes of autism, at least the autism symptoms. And one thing I can say that's in common with probably most, if not all, of the diseases that are on the rise, autism is not the only one that's increasing exponentially. Asthma, allergies, ADHD, arthritis, heart disease, cancer, these all have in common an inflammatory component. And there's a lot of people that try to blame, like, oh, our diet's too rich in omega-6 fatty acids, we need more omega-3s. And that is one helpful strategy, but that's not really what's driving it. This is a system issue primarily from my reading of the scientific literature, at least, and what makes sense logically. What happens, the immune system is a complicated, it's our army against, not only against pathogens, but also as a way of, it's kind of like the National Guard in like a disaster type situation. They come in, they clear out, there's a cleanup process. So the immune system not only destroys pathogens, but it also clears out damaged tissue to make room for rebuilding. And what the inflammatory process is critical because that's the part that removes the debris. The issue is when that process doesn't come off. So the pro-inflammatory cytokines are overactive in autism. And where that becomes a problem, not only is it destructive to tissue, which is where the visible symptoms of inflammation are like, swollen finger, red skin, like that's the visible symptom of inflammation. But what it can also do at the cellular level is a lot of those inflammatory cytokines inhibit mitochondrial enzymes. So we get inefficient energy production that's happening when inflammation is in overdrive. And your mitochondria are what give your brain cell, well, really every cell of your body, energy to function. So if your brain doesn't have energy to function, regardless of whether you're feeding it enough glucose and enough fatty acids or whatever it's using to produce that energy, if that engine is not working efficiently, it's wasting a lot of that energy. And we can see that on an organic acid test when a child has very high levels of the Krebs cycle intermediates. That's telling us that those intermediates are getting wasted. They're supposed to be going through the cycle and getting interconverted, where they can then produce electron donors to go to the electron transport chain, and then they produce ATP through there. So if those organic acids are just getting peed out because those enzymes that make those conversions are not working efficiently, then we're wasting that energy. So we're breaking down the glucose, but we're supposed to get 38 ATP out of it, and maybe we're only getting 14. Insert some number that's less, and that's where the inefficiency. That's why we need a lot of times more of those vitamins than what the authorities have determined adequate, because we need to try and accelerate those enzymes to compensate for things that are inhibiting them, like the inflammation.
It's very interesting. Now, I'm glad you raised the issue with the phenols. I've heard a lot of parents, raise that issue. And yeah, to summarize, you said inflammation is driving some of the causes of autism, and that's profound, because that's not what parents have been told leaving the doctor's office. Many parents that have left the doctor's office were told, your child has autism, goodbye and good luck, right? The doctor didn't say inflammation could be playing a role in your child's autism symptoms. So food for thought. Now, I know that your son has received ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. Tell us a little bit more about ABA, your thoughts on ABA, and is ABA covered by medical insurance in America?
Yeah, I didn't know anything about ABA when my son was first diagnosed. In fact, it wasn't even in like the information packet that we got from our developmental pediatrician, who he himself has a grown child with autism, probably about David's age, I would guess. And so he didn't know anything about ABA. In fact, we were the ones that told him about ABA once Myron had been in it for several months. And I think he started telling other patients about that. But so ABA was very helpful. What we noticed early on, though, is that the way that the center was based, the way that the center was set up, was not really suiting his needs. We had already he had already been being treated for biomedically for about a year before he even made it to the ABA center. So he was ahead in a lot of ways. He had language. He was making progress. We needed to accelerate. We needed to use the time that we had to really maximize that window of opportunity that we opened up with the biomedical treatments. But he would like have some behavior that they were working on extinguishing, and they'd extinguish it, but it was kind of like playing that game whack-a-mole. I don't know if you have that in South Africa, but it's one where the little moles pop up and you smack it, and then another one pops up. So it was kind of like, okay, we get rid of this behavior, but then another behavior would take its place. And it was almost like a pressure relief valve. Like he was like, okay, I can't do that, but he still had the urge to like let out that anxiety or whatever it was he was experiencing. So it would just emerge as another behavior. And he was learning a lot of these behaviors from other kids in the center. And, I pointed that out to his ECBA, and, I was kind of told, like, we know what we're doing. We know what we're doing. But finally, by, about 10 months in, he had made a lot of progress. So don't get me wrong, but he just wasn't, he was starting to plateau, and I didn't see him getting to where he was going to be school ready in time. And so I looked at another ABA company that had recently opened up. I explained the situation. I said, we've got such and such insurance. Can you have his therapist accompany him to this private preschool that we can enroll him in? And they looked into it and they said they could. And so I basically had this plan laid out and brought it to his BCBA and said, look, we're going to be moving him to another center if we don't get change here. And change happened instantly at that point. And there just happened to be, it was like the perfect geographical setup. There was a preschool right next door to where he was receiving his ABA center-based services. And they agreed to, this part was their doing, the idea of having him go over there for 1 hour a day with his therapist. And then after a week, maybe, just adding an hour a week. And I was, trying to push that process, and they were trying to walk it back, slow it down. And, but we eventually got to a point where he was attending full days at the neurotypical preschool with neurotypical peers. And it was so similar to reading your son Aaron's story. The kids in the preschool actually, they actually preferred my son's therapist to their own classroom teacher. They looked at her like she was the teacher. Because, these instructors, as you call them, are just, I don't know where to find them. I wouldn't have the patience and energy to do what they do, but he came a long way in that time. And then unfortunately, that was right when the COVID nonsense, started happening, and they were totally out of school for a little while. And then when they came back, they had to wear masks. So we decided to homeschool for a whole year until the mask stuff stopped, because I didn't think that would be good social experience for him. And I also didn't want his first memories of school to be like this prison. So, we we had to homeschool for a year, but then when he went to his first grade class, he was evaluated and they said, we don't believe that your son's going to need any accommodations. He doesn't need an individualized education plan. We'll reassess this, in a month's time. We'll have a meeting and we'll meet with the teacher and we'll meet with you guys and we'll discuss whether we think that's the plan to go through it. And we met and we all agreed that he didn't need any special accommodations.
What a wonderful outcome. And what we do as well at the Star Academy, we will determine if the child has got prerequisite skills for school, and then we will help the parents to try and find a play school, a nursery school, or a school that will accept the child into the mainstream classroom. I am so happy that instinctively you moved him to that classroom setting, because he obviously was ready for that. He had the prerequisite skills. And you can see how much he benefited so much from being included in the mainstream that he landed up accelerating his learning and reaching a point where he didn't even need any more support. So where you deliver that ABA, really depends on the specific needs of the child. And for him, moving him was absolutely critical at that point in time. Now, autism takes its toll on the family. How did you and your wife manage to stay together and not rip each other to pieces during all this crisis?
I think you'd be more qualified to answer that question because you went through it twice. You had a very difficult time. You continued with David. So I think you'd be more qualified. I'm going to guess that most of your audience is probably mothers that have children. They're currently in the autism crisis, or somewhere in that window of time. And I think probably just giving them some insight into what's going on in the father's mind and the father's heart might speak to more of your audience. I would say, because men are more guarded, we kind of have like a fortress over our feelings. Sometimes that communication just really breaks down. And what I can share with you, which might not be the case with your child's father, but very well could be, is that when you receive that autism diagnosis, it doesn't really change your motherly instincts at all. It just causes them to come out with a fury. Your instincts are to nurture, support, and love. And those are instincts of a father too, or at least they should be. But primarily, the male instinct is to provide, protect, and the important one that gets very neglected and insulted by the autism condition is the desire to mentor. So when you have this child and it's very difficult to connect with that child, that mentoring instinct just basically gets suppressed, and it's very depressing. And what does mentoring a 2-year-old look like? Well, I mean, it could be something as simple as playing catch with them, which I didn't get to play catch with my son until he was 4.5, because he couldn't. So it's very hard for a father to connect with the autistic child, and that can be very demeaning, demoralizing, and just defeating for a man. And you couple that with the very real fact, somewhat unavoidable, that your romantic relationship with your spouse is never going to be the same. How can you expect a woman who's doing 16 hours a day of just all the duties that are needed to keep up with this crisis, have any energy for you, for the man, for that romantic aspect? I think it's just asking too much. And that's just like, the death blow for a lot of guys. And so I don't know if this advice, depending on where your listeners are at in their stage, maybe just hearing that can help them, if anything, just maybe forgive, if you're no longer with their spouse anymore, if you're one of the 80% of marriages that, with autism that don't make it. Maybe that can just help you forgive, because harboring resentment's not going to be good for you, and it's not going to be good for your child either. And I think maybe having that insight maybe will be helpful for some people.
Thank you for sharing that wisdom. And Martin and I have had autism in our life for many, many years. It was a roller coaster. You just got to hold on. You got to hold on to faith. You got to find your hope. You got to hold on to hope and faith. Sometimes I would let him win an argument. Sometimes he would let me win an argument. So we took turns. Okay.
Yeah.
But I always tell parents, don't fight each other. Fight autism. Don't fight each other. So that's my...
And that's so important, that you be on the same page. There's a lot of trust that you have to have for your spouse when they're suggesting, let's go to Mexico and do stem cells. Like, that's not an introductory discussion that you have with someone that you just met. That takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of willingness to communicate and work through things you might disagree on. But that being on the same page is a big challenge for, I think, a lot of couples.
I agree. I think that parents need to just keep an open mind. Keep an open mind, do the research. I would also always say, don't adopt somebody else's opinion. Your friend said they don't believe in stem cells, or the doctor said they don't have enough proof that diet can help children. Go and do your own research. Take your time, and I think something also important that you highlighted was communication. Efficient communication is so important for so many reasons. Now, tell us more about your autism recovery coaching service that you provide parents. Do you only consult with parents in America? Do you consult with parents internationally? And how can parents get in touch with you?
Thanks for asking that. So my role in this process is as a health coach. So I'm not able to diagnose, I can't prescribe. I do work with a physician that can order lab testing. So if you're based in the United States, at least, I can order most lab testing for you if your own personal physician is not willing to do that. What I tend to focus on, which is what kind of differentiates my service from that of seeing a doctor, which you should also be doing, at least periodically, checking and running suggestions through them. What I do is I like to educate my parents. I like to teach them what I see is going on with their particular child situation, and also what goes on generally with the autism biotype, so to speak. Because autism, there's several subgroups of autism. They all share, some very real common similarities. So we can treat the common things, we can address that, and then also trying to lead them to specialists, or at least tell them about different subtypes that seem to be impacting their child more than it might be affecting someone else's child. So, like, for example, pandas is a contributing factor to autism in a certain subgroup. but it may not apply very much to another child. So using a cookie cutter approach, which, and I'm not bad mouthing any of the doctors that are in the autism treatment world, but it seems there's really no way to be a specialist in everything. You're a jack of all trades or a master of none, as the saying. So doctors tend to have like one thing that they're really good at, and then they're kind of not oblivious, but just not really focused on other areas. So you would have to see the right specialist for your child's individual makeup. I do try to help guide my clients in that direction as well. One thing I can do is, which seems to be helpful for a lot of kids, is that they'll come to me with like a list of 37 different supplements, and it's driving mom crazy because she's got to put together 37 pills every day at certain times, and they can't be taken. They got to be taken certain time away from food, with food, this, that, and the other thing. And I work with a compounding center that can put those supplements together into one bottle. So it doesn't necessarily cut down on the number of pills a whole lot, but it can cut down on the number of bottles you have in your cabinet that you can potentially get confused. Give them that one today, that kind of thing. If the child's not able to swallow capsules yet, we can work on that. If the child just isn't ready for that process yet, we can compound things into powder that can be mixed in juice or with food that can be consumed that way. So there's a lot of things that we can do. Basically, I have more time that I can spend on your child's case because doctors might be charging $400 to $800 an hour for their time, and you're not going to want them to spend that time teaching you how to swallow. So I think that I charge a much more affordable $60 an hour at the United States currency. And yes, I do see clients from all over the world. I work with clients in the UK. I have some in Germany. Most of mine are US based, but that doesn't have to be that way. I can work with anyone.
Chris, I am so excited for all the parents listening today to be introduced to you, to know about your coaching service. And I'm very excited as well, of course, for the South African parents, who desperately need guidance from somebody like you. I think they're going to be sleeping a lot better this evening, knowing that there's somebody like you out there that can actually hold their hand, guide them. As you said, I know you work with a physician as well, and I'm overjoyed that you have a compounding pharmacy. And I think it's such a super great idea that, so many of the moms complain, I just can't get all of this down. So the fact that you can help with that and solve all these number of vitamins that they're having to get down the kid is also really, really exciting. So I'm sure a lot of parents are going to be in touch with you. And please share an inspirational quote with us.
Okay. An inspirational quote that I have is from a man named James Stockdale. And for our US listeners, you might have heard of him. Your South African listeners might not know who James Stockdale is. He was a prisoner of war during the US Vietnam War. And he made it out after 6.5 years in captivity of being tortured. And I think there's a lot of similarity in what parents going through the autism crisis, both in terms of that time frame. I think 6.5 years is a pretty similar time frame to what many people can look forward to or not look forward to. And in a lot of ways, it is torture. So this is what I wanted to share. It's a little bit of a lengthy quote, but bear with me. Once James Stockdale had invited Jim Collins, a management scholar, out to lunch. Collins asked Stockdale about how he persevered while in the prisoner of war camp. He said, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into a defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade. Collins then asked about the kinds of people who didn't make it out of the prisoner of war camp. His response was the optimists, and he explained. Oh, they were the ones that said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Sorry, this is hard. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. Easter would come, Easter would go. And then by Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. After a moment of silence, Stockdale finished his thought. This is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be.
Wow. Chris, that moved me. That was special.
Well, your book moved me as well.
Will you send me that quote? I just want to share it with everybody as well. I'd like to post it on Facebook and just let everyone have a copy of that. That was very, very, very incredibly special. Thank you for that quote. Thank you for your beautiful message. Thank you for helping the autism community. I'm so excited to introduce you to our parents and our listeners today. And thank you so much for joining us and for all the valuable information that you shared.
Thank you, Elena. It's an honor that someone who's contributed so much to the autism community would value what I have to say. And it's a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.